It's great to be with you. I'm going to share the biblical theology of disability. It's a great topic. Some of this content, this will be the first time I'm formally teaching on these 10 pillars of disability theology that we've worked the last couple of years to develop, and I'll share a little bit about that. But I'm excited to be able to present this to you and get some questions, some in the middle and then at the end. So let me start out, though, by sharing a little bit about myself, just so you know kind of where I come from. And a handful of you know me. We've been able to work together, but this is a little bit about me. You can see my family up there. I've been married for 22 years to my wife, and we have 5 children, ages about 18 down to 7. And I have had personal and professional experiences with disability for years, and it's really shaped and formed my the lens through which I look at everything, at God, at people, and at the nature of what my life is about and what all of our lives, really where they find value. And you can see there in the bottom blue box, I have played various roles in my life. I started out my professional career as a therapist and was in the field of psychology. Then I had an encounter with the Lord that convinced me of the messiahship of Jesus, and went a different direction in my life, and actually went into ministry and did an MDiv and rethought my worldview through a biblical lens, and ended up going into pastoral ministry. And then started having children. And when I had a child born with a disability, I call that God's hook in the jaw that got me to the place where he wanted to use me, which is at this intersection of disability and faith. And I ended up teaching middle school special ed for a little while, and then ended up going into the academy, and now a professor to train future teachers to teach students with disabilities. And I'm currently, as Bill mentioned, working at Wheaton College. You can see the picture there, and they hired me to build a special ed program, which we did. And then that work has grown now to a new Center for Faith and Disability with a broader mission from the academy to really help promote communities of belonging and flourishing for all in classrooms and congregations. And all of this collectively, I have forged a perspective to see disability through a biblical lens, and I'll be sharing some of that today. I'm going to start with a quote from Henry Nouwen. And Henry Nouwen, his life was changed through encountering Adam. And so I'm going to read a quote that Henry Nouwen, who was in the academy and ended up going and giving his life to serve and live with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that impact was so transformative for him. So let's listen to his words. Adam, you can see him there. Adam was sent to bring good news to the world. It was his mission, as it was the mission of Jesus. Adam was very simply, quietly, and uniquely there. He was a person who by his very life announced the marvelous mystery of our God. I am precious, beloved, whole, and born of God. Adam bore silent witness to this mystery, which has nothing to do with whether or not he could speak, walk, or express himself, whether or not he made money, had a job, was fashionable, famous, married, or single. It had to do with his being. He was and is a beloved child of God. It is the same news that Jesus came to announce, and it is the news that all those who are poor keep proclaiming in and through their very weakness. Life is a gift. Each one of us is unique, known by name, and loved by the one who fashioned us. Unfortunately, there is a very loud, consistent, and powerful message coming to us from our world that leads us to believe that we must prove our belovedness by how we look, by what we have, and by what we can accomplish. We become preoccupied with making it in this life, and we are very slow to grasp the liberating truth of our origins and our finality. We need to hear the message announced and see the message embodied over and over again. Only then do we find the courage to claim it and to live from it. Some deep truths from Henry Nouwen and the transformation that he experienced by relationally engaging and serving people with disability labels. And that transformation, I really believe, is something that is needed by all of us. And one of the ways I've come to talk about these are these 10 pillars of biblical theology. These 10 different pillars were developed in collaboration with theologians and scholars and practitioners and individuals and family members impacted by disability over a multi-year process. So let me give you a little bit of a window into how that was developed and where you can find these online. So over the past 2 years, these have been in kind of organic stages of development. The first step was just really drafting some text. That text was refined and shared with many people and edited and revised. And then after it kind of solidified into taking some shape and form, we ended up dividing it up into pillars, sections, paragraph sections. And then over time, we added from 9 to 10. There was some content about suffering that was in there that just felt like it needed its own pillar. So we extracted that and developed them from 9 to 10, which is in their form now. And then we ended up adding titles and a preamble to the whole statement. And then finally, quite recently, we just developed these icons with the key words that you can see above those pictures. And so all of these together can be found on the wheaton.edu website / the center's address, which you'll see again later. And then this Disability Foundations, which then has this theology of disability as one of the foundations. And I wrote an article like last year called A Biblical Case for Inclusion when we only had 9 pillars. And that article is on the Center for Faith and Disabilities website as well. It was written to take these 9 pillars and kind of unpack them applicationally for Christian schools to think theologically about the mandate to include students with disabilities as part of their mission to serve all students. And then I worked with an organization called All Belong to talk about that article and the content of that article in a podcast that's also available on the website for the Center for Faith and Disability. So here are the 10 pillars, again, sectioned off into 2 categories that I'll be breaking this up in this presentation to think about God's purposefulness in time. Now, this is the theological concept of time that in biblically gets broken up by 2 different words. So if you've had theological training or orientation, these words may be familiar. I'm not going to do a lot with them, but just mention them. Chronos and kairos are 2 different kinds of time. And the word is used to talk about time. And one of the ways that that's talked about that I want to frame here is chronos tends to be thought of as clock time. It's more chronological. It's where we get the word. It's linear, it's event-oriented, and it's an orderly, sequential kind of an outworking of time. Kairos, on the other hand, is very, very different. That's the kind of timeless time that comes out of events where you really encounter someone or something in a way where there's a presence, there's an impact, it's transformational. And these 2 times have a rich theological heritage. And so I'm going to use these 2 kinds of time as a way to frame these 10 pillars and quickly go through 5 of them and then unpack the next 5 a little more carefully. But first, the preamble. Though disability affects every race, ethnicity, religion, age, sex, and socioeconomic class, what is perceived as a disability and who gets labeled accordingly varies from culture to culture. When measured against some level of minimal or average performance or standing, we must acknowledge the arbitrariness of such standards. So the concept of disability, when you interrogate it, it tends to dissolve a little bit as a social construct that in different cultures can mean different things. And so what does it mean? That's part of looking at disability through a biblical lens, tries to help us get beyond the limitations of a secular humanistic worldview, and look at the nature of what it means to be human, even with our weakness and imperfections, and try to grasp the divine essence of what it means to be a human. So this first part of the preamble just acknowledges the squishiness, if you will, of the construct of disability. But given the prevalence of disability in society, even those whose loved ones have not yet been touched by it, they will likely be impacted on some level eventually. So this really makes the point that disability is actually very, very common. 20%, close to 20% of Americans have a disability. And this sometimes we can slice the pie in different ways. Physical, I like to call them atypicalities. Physical atypicalities, intellectual differences, developmental delays or disabilities, neuroatypical wiring that can change the typical pattern of the way cognitions are wired, and the autism has given rise to another label for neuroatypical, but then also mental illness and even aging. These things all bring in kind of the margins of what it means to be human. And when we look really carefully, those things at the margins actually become much more of a majority for those who are paying attention. So by way of a preamble, it's just this: the idea of disability can be a bit squishy, and it's much more common and prevalent and hard to get at because it can mean different things. So with that as a preamble, let me quickly run through 5 Chronos pillars, which is more familiar territory for theological thinking. And the first pillar is that we are all image bearers, that really in creation, God created the heavens and the earth. He created human beings, and he created us to be in intimate relationship with him and with others. That was the nature of what it means to be an image bearer, to image the relationality of God. And we are a glorious reflection. God's glory is revealed in creation, and human beings are the pinnacle of that creation. And so he created the world and he said, good. He created human beings and he said, very good. And so we image God not only individually, but there's also a collective imaging. And whether that be in male and female through marriage, whether it be in a family unit, whether it be in a congregational community, whether it be in a denominational community, whether it be in a national church, John wrote the letters to the 7 churches. And this was a communal identity, a collective identity of a corpus of people following the Messiah. So the point here in this first pillar is really just that God, in creation, there's glory in human beings and in creation. And that image, we reflect it in a glorious way, individually and collectively. But then in the fall, there is a distorted reflection where we are alienated from God, and the relationship that we have with one another becomes normatively strained. The selfishness, the laziness, the irritability, all of these things that theologians would call curved, we are curved in on ourselves. That kind of baked in self-referential, self-serving kind of a mentality inevitably will cause friction in the way that we imperfectly love others. And so we are alienated and strained. And the atypicality from disability, we like to talk about that sometimes as 2 kinds of impairments: a functional impairment and a social impairment. So the functional impairment is kind of like when we have minds that don't work the way we think they should, body parts that don't work the way that we want them to. Those are impairments in the way a body part works, or our minds are wired, that impairs our functioning. But there's other impairments socially, which are a function of other people's perceptions of us and the kind of social barriers that get put up. And so all of these things kind of compromise that glorious reflection of love freely given and received from God to his people and his creation, and from people to each other. It's all naturally compromised in the fall. And a nice succinct way of summarizing this comes from Stephanie Hubach in a book called Same Lake, Different Boat, where she really highlights 3 different disability worldviews. And if you remember nothing else from this seminar. This is a really nice way to contrast a biblical worldview from some other common ways of thinking. So you might think of a modern worldview about disability as basically looking at disability as an abnormal part of a normal world. The world is normal. I'm normal. You're normal. The world's normal. But people with disabilities, that's abnormal. And that's kind of a more modern view. It's the historical view. It's a medical model view that disability is like a disease and it needs to be cured. But then that really has kind of negative connotations where somebody with a disability will feel like, well, I'm not broken. I don't need to be fixed. And so a postmodern view comes along and says, no, disability is actually a normal part of a normal world. And while that worldview may correct some of the negative assumptions of brokenness, of disability, it actually doesn't really map on very well to reality. Because when someone has had a traumatic brain injury or is paralyzed, all of a sudden you don't walk into their hospital room and say, congratulations, nor do you just ignore the changes in their life. There are real challenges that are associated with the struggle of atypicality or disability on whatever dimension. And so how do you deal with that? Which is why the biblical view of disability really maps onto reality best. And that can be summarized by this phrase that disability really is a normal part of an abnormal world. And in Genesis 3, when sin entered the world and alienation and brokenness becomes normative, then that there's a normative struggle in the world, and the world is not normal based on what God wants it to be like and created it to be. And so then in the biblical story, which is why these pillars are a biblical theology going from Genesis to Revelation, the third pillar is one of promise. God promised to remedy creation's corruption, and he promised that there would be full restoration, and that distortion and brokenness and alienation would be overturned, and the power of sin and death would be reversed. And that promise really came into focus through a messianic seed. The messianic seed, Genesis 3:15, called the proto-euangelion, of the initial good news, was announced that there would be a seed coming. And that promise then is fulfilled, or at least confirmed, in the coming of Jesus as the Messiah. The scriptures and the gospels tell of his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. And in a sense, the apostles who wrote the New Testament were really confirming the hope of the prophets. God's original promise in Genesis 3:15 that there would be a seed coming grows through the promises to Abraham that his family would be a beachhead to reach all the families of the earth. That family promise would be through Isaac, not Ishmael, through Jacob and not Esau. And then that family grows to a nation in the incubator of Egypt and gets delivered from slavery in Egypt through the Red Sea and comes to Mount Sinai, and God covenants with the nation. And then Israel becomes a nation, a beachhead nation to reach the nations of the world. And then King David comes as the quintessential king in the spirit of the future king, to fulfill all of these promises to bless all the families of the earth, all the nations of the earth, through this king who would be the messianic seed. And so that event historically then foreshadows the next major event chronologically, which is still future, which is the ultimate restoration of all things in the age to come. And the scriptures really in Old and New Testament talk about this age and the age to come, the Olam Hazeh, the Olam Haba. And that age transition is pivots on the return of Jesus. And so the Messiah will return to the earth. And it's at that time where there will be no more tears and there will be no more death. The goals of Tikkun Olam and the restoration of the world, the reparation of the world, will be finally fulfilled. And so these 5 pillars reflect a chronological kind of orientation to 4 past events and 1 future event that begins to really set the framework to then do the hard work of thinking about disability and what it means in the context of God's design from creation to consummation. And I think it's really important to have an eschatological, that's a fancy theological word for end times, but it's important to have an eschatological framework from creation to redemption and consummation, to have it all in view in order to really be able to situate the challenges of disability rightly. And so let me just pause and see if there are questions on any of that before we get into the more challenging and difficult work, because these are very familiar tropes that are fairly unanimous within theological circles, no matter what flavor or brand of Christianity you have. If you take the Bible seriously, you tend to fall out on these kind of principles that are not very contentious at all. But are there any questions so far? All right. Well, Kairos, as I said, it's I'm calling it opportunity time. You know, if you're with someone and you have this sense, I like to think of it as timeless time, where it's the quality of the time. Chronos is more quantity time. Kairos is more quality time. And so I'm describing it here as opportunity time. It's opportunities really to build faith, to build endurance, and to grow in intimacy with God and others. And each one of these pillars really becomes opportunities for those things, to deepen your faith, to deepen the endurance that is a marker of spiritual maturity, and to cultivate the thing that actually in my empirical research on quality of life, faith and the power of social relationships, both with God and with others, and the way that that really contributes to flourishing, to thriving, to quality of life outcomes. That's been a lot of my empirical research. And these moments, these Kairos moments, I think are actually enhanced by the experience of disability, even though it introduces some challenge to the circumstances. And so we'll see that, I think, in each one of these pillars. So I'm going to walk through them, and I'm going to, on the first 5 that I shared with you, I didn't read all of the text. You can go back and read those on the website if you want to dig in more, but I will read the actual text of these 5 in a progressive way, as I did with the preamble and the now in quote. So the 5th pillar is this, that God's goodness and sovereignty in the face of trials. So through the story of Jesus's encounter with a man born blind, this is John 9, we see Jesus addressing the societal ramifications of disability. These would be the social impairments that I referenced in the 2nd pillar, in addition to the functional ramifications. And so remember, the functional ramifications are when a body part doesn't work right, the way maybe it was intended to, or originally designed to, or is typical to function as. And the man born blind was impaired functionally with his eyesight. The societal ramifications, or the social impairments, are all those barriers that result from other people's maybe negative assumptions of you because you have a disability, or all of those kinds of dynamics. And so in the story of John 9, and Jesus first corrects his disciples' misconceptions that this man experienced disability because of personal sin. Remember, the disciples asked him, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus said neither. So he corrects his disciples' misconceptions that this man experienced disability because of personal sin, which would have created these social barriers for the man born blind. Jesus instead declares, this happened that the works of God might be displayed in his life. Jesus did what he does best, which is problematizing our pursuit of answers by reframing questions and leading us ultimately to the underlying need that we have, even when our questions are wrongly framed. The man's disability was recognized as purposeful in the hands of a good, loving, and sovereign God at work in the context of a broken world. And so Jesus then restored the man's vision. In the story, he goes on and then actually, after he makes that audacious claim, it's not the man that sinned, not his parents, overturning conventional wisdom and saying, pointing to the glory of God being revealed. But then he does go on and restore the man's vision. And this demonstration of God's power and purpose offers us a perspective into God's work among and through us, despite the brokenness of the fall. And we see Jesus holding in tension human brokenness and difficulty with divine value and purpose. He really does that. And that was one of the things that first captured my attention, of this man from Galilee walking the land that I had grown up learning about in religious school. And with such authority, he is comforting the afflicted. And at the turn of a dime, he is afflicting the comfortable. And he just has this way of identifying and calling out the fundamental nature of what it means to be human, and restores the glory of what it means to be human. And this tension of human brokenness and difficulty, which is real, but also divine value and purpose. And no matter how hard we try, I don't believe we can ever fully get God's economy in a box. We can never fully tame it or understand it. But it should be simple enough that simple minds can grasp it, because Jesus said that these things should be grasped by little children, and the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. And so just like Jesus held these things in tension, human brokenness with divine value and human difficulty with divine purpose, we need to, as best we can, hold those in tension as well. And that's a good starting point to dive into some of the challenges of disability through a biblical lens, because it seems to inevitably problematize whatever ways we think of that just make things easier to understand the whys of everything. And so this fifth pillar of disability really frames up the nature of disability as an invitation, I think, for us to press in, to be transformed in a relationship with God and a relationship with others. And so the next pillar is God's economy. In God's economy, human value is not measured by what we can or cannot do, but instead by whose we are. This is where we flip from the economy of doing to the economy of being, and relating with God as the source then of our identity. We were not created as human doings. We were not created as human thinkings. We were created as human beings. And so our value is not defined by what we do or how smart we are, but by our very being. There's value, there's glory in being created in the image of God. And then in that relationship with him, our identity flows in his economy. And we can look at throughout the scriptures, but here's just one example of when Moses hesitated to accept God's commission in the book of Exodus to deliver his people by citing a self-perceived limitation. Remember, he said, I'm slow of speech, right? People in disability theology circles talk about, was it a stutter? What happened? God brought Aaron along to be his mouthpiece. God responds to him, who made the human mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. See, God sees no barriers to using those with disabilities to accomplish his purposes. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul declares that the seemingly weaker members of the believing community are actually indispensable and to be given double honor. Furthermore, human weakness is actually portrayed as a platform to display God's power. And as Bill mentioned earlier, I am a parent of multiple children with disability. And it's that personal challenge that parenting is hard. Parenting a child with disability, I think, is harder. I like to say parenting brings the best out in you and the worst out in you. And with disabilities in view, The highs are a little bit higher and the lows are a little bit lower. Everything's just intensified, I think. And the truth of the fact that God can take my weakness and my imperfections and actually perfect his strength is great hope. I find hope in this every day. Because those who are perceived as weak and less worthy of praise by human standards are not only suitable in God's economy, but at times they are uniquely gifted conduits of God's grace, mercy, and love. And through eyes of faith, that can be discerned. I like to think sometimes of disability as a veil of glory. Disability as veiled glory. And I have felt really stirred and called by the Lord to help see that veil lift so that the glory is revealed in his image, and the glory of his image can be revealed through all people, but particularly when disability is in view, restoring the honor of the indispensability of those we might deem weaker to let God's power be revealed and perfected. And so there's a platform here of weakness in God's economy that's not to be eschewed. It's not to be resisted. It's not to be run away from. It's not to be belittled or shamed. It's actually to be embraced as normative this side of glory, normative in the fall, normative that all of us are weak. And in God's economy, there's something of his power that he offers in these kairos moments of opportunity to touch his strength in our weakness and to honor that in others. The next pillar, 7, is God's law of love. God is love, and when Jesus walked the earth, he said, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another." And it's this sacrificial love that will necessarily make demands on how we treat other people. It's very easy when we are comfortable in our lives and we have relationships of convenience and we have monetary capacities to minimize suffering and challenge in our lives. It can be very easy to think we love well, but true love requires sacrifice. It means putting your needs over my own. If you are married, then it becomes no mystery that we are naturally selfish, and learning how to put someone else in front of your own needs is the nature of what it means to be serving your spouse, sacrificial love. And when you have kids, when you have children, I like to say getting married teaches you how selfish you are, and having children teaches you how impatient you are. And the sacrificial love required to put my wife's well-being and my children's well-being in front of mine puts us in a holy orbit where we all fall on our face, and yet we all get up and get on every day trying to reach out and cling to the Lord with his kairos goodness and sovereignty and love, and hopefully look a little more like him every day, because that sacrificial love will put demands on us. And that's good. We need to be challenged outside of our comfort zone. I remember a phrase, we have this on a magnet on our stove at home: life begins just beyond your comfort zone. It's an invitation to these kairos moments. And you see, as finite creatures, human beings, you and me, we are all limited in various ways. All of us are. And none of us are autonomous or completely self-sufficient, nor were we meant to be. We are not meant to be islands of independence and autonomy. We are meant to be interdependent. And so disability can enhance the visibility and tangibility of God's love within a community. And this can happen by focusing love's demands where they reflect God's character best. Additionally, people with disabilities can lead others into loving well by demonstrating God's love in unique ways. And so when you think about a community that comes together and people with disabilities are received and those gifts are released into the community, there becomes a beautiful synergistic give and take of a love dance whereby people with disabilities don't become objects of mercy. They're not just recipients of care. they become subjects of relationships and givers of good gifts. And there's a giving and receiving and a mutuality in a way that love's demands are fulfilled in the self-sacrificial giving in a way that doesn't glorify my gift. It glorifies the ultimate giver who's giving me grace to give. And it also there's glory in actually making yourself vulnerable to receive from someone else. And so in a sense, who has a disability and who has a gifting begins to kind of fade away a little bit when we look at communities really doing this well, in communities of belonging and flourishing, where, to use the language of the 5 stages of attitudes, Dan Vanderplatz, who's on this call, the co-laboring attitude of what it means to really go forth and to co-labor with one another, with all of our strengths and our gifts, with all of our weaknesses and failings, and really be united by the grace and by the power of the Spirit, of the love of God, to go and make sacrificial love visible in a way that restores the intimacy between people and between God and people in a way that restores that broken image of glory corporately in a community. And so making love visible is one of the Kairos opportunities in disability. I like to think of it as higher hanging fruit. You know, it's not low hanging fruit, easy, doing it on the fly. If it was easy, everybody'd be doing it, and you wouldn't need me to do a webinar on it, because it would be easy and obvious. But there's some higher hanging fruit, and I am personally continually daily challenged to grow in my own self-sacrificial love, personally and professionally, continuing to be a learner, to try to learn about God's economy and his love, and to bear witness to it verbally, but hopefully visibly, through my life individually, but also even my family corporately, and the communities that I serve hopefully reflect that love as well. 2 more pillars to go. The second to last is that God's people respond. Let's start moving into some practical here. As God's people, what is our role in responding to disability? The church is to manifest God's love, and the church here, theologically, it's the people of God. To use the language of Ephesians 2, it's the one new man, Jew and Gentile, united in the Messiah. It's the people of God are to manifest God's love to a watching world as we live in countercultural ways that reflect the values of God's kingdom on earth. I know some of you on this webinar, and I know some of the ways that you live a countercultural life because of the wheelchair, because of the extra supports that are needed, because of the extra challenges that you have. There is an imposed countercultural reality that is sometimes not welcomed, but it's something that we learn how to live with and deal with. And I'm kind of taking the countercultural witness of being a follower of Jesus and saying, maybe inviting us to think about the countercultural opportunities that there are in having or being impacted by a disability, or being a part of a community where there are individuals with disabilities, or just responding to other people with disability through a biblically defined lens that should lead to restoration of relationships and intimacy in ways that are glorious. And so with Jesus as our head, he's the head of the body, the Messiah is the head of the body, and we, as his people, constitute his body. And we are called to preserve unity in diversity. This is the language of Ephesians. Paul in Ephesians 4 says, do all that you can to preserve the spirit of unity through the bond of peace. And that unity, to preserve that unity, includes unity among the diversity of abilities. And then Ephesians goes on in chapter 4 to talk about the process of how we are to grow into the maturity and the stature of Jesus, meaning individually, but also corporately. We are to grow into the image of a perfectly loving, self-sacrificial God in the face of the Son of God. And as we contend for that, that growth is how we respond to preserve unity and to grow in maturity in that unity. And so that unity of God's people, it really doesn't depend on our talent or our intellect, but it really depends on our union with the Father through the Son by the power of the Holy Spirit. And it's this relational oneness in Messiah, who in John 17, with this high priestly prayer, he describes himself as one with the Father and prays for his followers that they would be unified with each other and with him, that all of our relational oneness would be back restored with the Father, and that relational oneness was the goal of his high priestly prayer in restoring humanity to each other, to the Father, and ultimately, like it says in Romans 8, all creation groans for the children of God to be revealed. And so this liberation of the ache and the groan of creation, and the ache and the groan of you and me, because of the inherent alienation, because of the brokenness of the fall, will ultimately be restored, which is why we need this eschatological frame that there is a future coming, and it might not change things the way we think they're going to change things as it relates to disability, which are some of the questions that we won't always have good answers for, but we should be trying. So the last part of this pillar here, furthermore, as God has placed each part in the body just as he wanted, so each has a divine purpose and gift that serves the body. Everyone has a gift and a purpose. And indeed, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the less honorable, so that there would be no division in the body. This is 1 Corinthians 12. But that the members would have the same concern for each other, so that if one member suffers, all suffer. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. And when there's unity among the family of God restored, I call it kingdom math. When grief is shared and it's received, when you can share your trials with somebody and they understand you and offer empathy and understand, the grief is halved and the joy is doubled. There's something that really, I think, ministers to our hearts when our burdens are carried by others with us. And I think that's part of God's purpose in the unity of his people, where he lets strengths and weaknesses be perfected in the complementarianism of strength and weakness, in a way that allows our suffering to be mitigated unto the restoration of all things, when all tears will be wiped away, and the joy to exponentially grow in these kairos moments where we touch the heart of the Father and we are able to be used by him to touch others. And that's kind of the kairos moments that we're after. And that's the response in preserving unity, in pursuing it, preserving it, and growing up into looking and sounding a lot more like Jesus. All right, the last pillar, hang in here, is God's presence and purpose in suffering. And this is the last pillar. This is the one that we added because it really just is the Mount Everest, if you will, of disability theology, where we really have to deal with the challenging and the inconvenient and annoying but inevitable reality of suffering that we're all going to experience. And so every one of us, whether we have a disability label or not, experiences suffering at some point in our lives. And for some, disability itself or society's response to disability, and you can see there the functional and the social aspects again, may create a source of physical or emotional suffering. So the question cries out in all of our hearts, where is God in that suffering? And so this question becomes especially poignant when disability is in view. So while God does not promise to remove all sources of suffering in this age, our present trials, they don't need to be eternal. They don't have to be eternal. And it's because of Jesus's own personal suffering on behalf of all people, his comfort, love, and actions now flow through us to help others in their distress, and vice versa. His word also reveals how he has used human suffering for his purposes, whether that be turning wayward hearts back to God, whether that's displaying God's power and works or sanctifying believers in holiness. We trust he works all things together for the good of his children. And that's that precious Romans 8:28 promise that he works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so lastly, amid even our deepest suffering, he has promised, the promise of the scriptures from cover to cover is that he has promised to be with us always, even to the end of the age, to eternally save, heal, and deliver us. And so even suffering, as the Mount Everest of disability theology, if you will, may not be removed nor fully explained, but just like Job asks questions of the Lord, and in the end, it's not the answers that satisfies Job, it's the revelation of the answerer, the one who reveals himself to Job at the end of the book, where Job says, I repent in dust and ashes. Who can understand these things? And he was satisfied because he was restored to an intimate encounter with the living God. And the need for answers became secondary. And so that's a nice place to kind of pull out of the rigors of the pillars of theology, disability theology, and here is the summary of the quantity, time, chronos pillars of creation, fall, promise, and then the two comings of the Messiah, where the promises of the prophets are confirmed in the Messiah's first coming, fulfilled, the restoration of all things still future. And in the meantime, we're between the comings, and we've got these opportunities where disability will reveal our weakness, make love, demands of love, but make it visible as well, where God's wanting to unite us in humility, in a way that allows our suffering not always to be removed, not always to be explained, but always to be mitigated by the transcendent superior value of the presence and purpose of a good, faithful, and loving God. And that is his purpose at all times, the self-revealing God who wants to be known and his glory revealed at all times, and God's purposefulness in all time, chronos and kairos.